Let me tell you a story about justice, resilience, and the power of speaking truth to power. It's a tale that begins with prejudice and unfolds into a moment of profound accountability, one that leaves its mark on an entire system. Picture this: an elderly black woman, calm and dignified, finds herself at the center of a routine stop by a brash officer in a quiet suburban neighborhood. What seems like an ordinary encounter takes a dangerous turn when the officer, driven by his own unchecked biases, escalates the situation beyond reason. But this isn't just a story of conflict. It's a story of revelation. What happens when the target of such prejudice reveals herself to be more than meets the eye, a woman of authority, with evidence that could expose corruption far beyond this single interaction? As you listen, consider how moments like these shape our understanding of justice and equality. If you're moved by stories that inspire empathy and change, subscribe to this channel and join our growing community. And tell us in the comments, what does justice mean to you? Let's reflect on this together as we dive into the first chapter of this powerful tale. It was a crisp autumn morning when Officer Marcus Wade, a man of firm jawlines and unshakable authority, or so he thought, pulled into the quiet, tree-lined neighborhood of Sycamore Ridge. The houses here were modest but well kept, the kind of community where children played freely and neighbors greeted each other warmly. Yet, as Marcus scanned the streets from his patrol car, his gaze lingered on a lone figure. A woman, hunched slightly with age, walked steadily along the sidewalk. She carried a modest cloth bag and wore a brown trench coat, her silver hair glinting under the pale sunlight. To Marcus, she didn't belong. His instincts, shaped less by training and more by personal bias, whispered, suspicious. He wasn't entirely sure why. Perhaps it was her deliberate stride, or the subtle confidence in her posture. Perhaps it was her skin dark, beautiful, and resilient. With a quick flick of his lights, he pulled up alongside her. "Ma'am," he said, stepping out, his hand resting lightly on the holster at his side. "What brings you here today?" The woman turned slowly, her face a map of times passing. Lines of wisdom crinkled her eyes, and her expression was calm but firm. "I live here," she replied, her voice steady, her southern lilt a testament to decades of resilience. "Just out for a walk." But Marcus wasn't satisfied. His mind raced to justify his unease. She was too composed, too certain of herself. His authority felt challenged, though she had done nothing but respond to his question. "Mind if I see some identification?" he pressed, his tone now clipped. The woman reached into her bag, moving with a deliberate slowness that betrayed a lifetime of practice in making others feel at ease. She handed over a state ID with the name Lena Harris. "This your house down the street?" he asked, pointing toward a modest white bungalow with a small porch swing swaying gently in the breeze. "It is," Lena said, her gaze unyielding. Marcus felt his control slipping. It wasn't about the ID, the house, or her demeanor. It was about him. He had expected compliance, perhaps even a touch of fear. Instead, Lena radiated something he couldn't quite place, a quiet power that unnerved him. And so he made a choice, one he would come to regret. Marcus's voice hardened. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to come with me for further questioning. You're acting suspicious, and I have reason to believe." "Reason to believe what?" Lena interrupted, her tone sharper now. "That I don't belong in my own neighborhood." Her words were like a mirror, reflecting back the biases Marcus had carried with him his entire career. But instead of pausing to reflect, he doubled down. "Don't make this harder than it has to be," he snapped, his hand now gripping her arm. The motion was swift but forceful, causing her to stumble slightly. The scene unfolded quickly. A small group of onlookers began to gather, their faces a mix of concern and outrage. A young mother with a stroller pulled out her phone, its lens capturing every moment. An elderly neighbor stood on his porch, shaking his head. Lena didn't resist. She didn't shout or fight back. Instead, she stood tall, her eyes locked on Marcus. "Is this how you treat everyone, officer?" she asked, her voice carrying a weight that silenced the murmurs of the crowd. As the situation escalated, Marcus's desperation grew. He radioed for backup, his words laced with urgency that didn't match the reality of the moment. Within minutes, another patrol car arrived, adding a layer of intimidation to an already tense scene. It wasn't until Lena was placed in handcuffs, her wrists bound with a metallic bite, that she finally spoke the words that would change everything. "Officer Wade," she began, her voice calm but unyielding. "You've made a grave mistake today. I suggest you call your superior before this goes any further," Marcus scoffed. "And why's that?" Lena met his gaze with a steady intensity. "Because I'm a federal agent with the Department of Homeland Security, and I've been investigating officers like you for the past 6 months." Her words hung in the air, their impact immediate and electric. The onlookers gasped, their murmurs growing louder. Marcus's grip faltered, his face flushing with a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Prove it," he said, his voice cracking slightly. With a slight tilt of her head, Lena gestured to the interior of her coat. One of the newly arrived officers, sensing the gravity of the situation, stepped forward and carefully reached inside. He pulled out a badge, its metallic sheen catching the sunlight, and a small recording device. "This has been recording since the moment you stopped me," Lena said, her tone matter of fact. "Every word, every action, documented." In that instant, the dynamic shifted entirely. Marcus, once so sure of his authority, now stood exposed. The weight of his actions, coupled with the undeniable evidence Lena carried, left him scrambling for justification. But Lena wasn't finished. Turning to the onlookers, she addressed them with a quiet strength that silenced even the most cynical. "This isn't just about me," she said. "It's about every person who has ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin or the assumptions others make about their worth. Today, we begin to hold those in power accountable." As her words resonated through the crowd, Marcus's world began to crumble. What had started as a routine stop was now a public reckoning, one that would only grow in intensity as Lena's story unfolded. But Lena's confrontation with Officer Wade was just the beginning. Little did the department know, Lena's investigation was about to unravel a web of corruption that ran far deeper than one man's actions. What secrets would her recordings uncover? And how would the city respond to the shocking revelations to come? Stay tuned for the next chapter of this transformative tale. The quiet hum of Sycamore Ridge's suburban morning was broken by murmurs of disbelief as the confrontation between Lena Harris and Officer Marcus Wade spiraled further out of control. The small crowd, now emboldened by Lena's calm revelation, stood frozen, their phones capturing every moment. Yet Marcus, stubborn and unwilling to accept the shift in power, clung desperately to the frayed threads of his authority. "You expect me to believe this?" he scoffed, gesturing dismissively at Lena's badge as though it were an accessory. "Not a testament to decades of service. Anyone can carry a fake badge." The accusation hung in the air, and for a moment, Lena said nothing. Her silence wasn't hesitation, it was calculation. She knew when to speak and when to let the weight of her presence do the talking. The quiet stretched long enough to make Marcus squirm, a slight crack in his bluster revealing his discomfort. Finally, she turned her gaze to the officer who had retrieved her badge. "Officer?" she inquired, her voice steady. "Jefferson," he replied, glancing uneasily between her and Marcus. "Officer Jefferson," Lena continued, her tone carrying the weight of command. "I suggest you verify my credentials immediately. You'll find everything in the DHS database. My badge number is 24173A and I report directly to Deputy Director Monroe." Jefferson hesitated, then nodded, stepping aside to make the call. As he spoke in hushed tones, the tension thickened. Marcus fidgeted, his hand brushing over his radio as though considering calling for more backup. The crowd murmured, the weight of their growing judgment pressing on him. Lena shifted her attention back to Marcus. Her voice softened, but it carried an undeniable strength. "You could have let this end quietly, Officer Wade, but instead, you chose to escalate. Why is that?" Marcus stiffened. "You were acting suspicious." "I have the right to question anyone I deem suspicious," she interrupted, her words cutting through his defense like a blade. "Let me ask you this. What was suspicious about me, officer? Was it my age, my demeanor, or simply the fact that I don't look like what you think belongs in this neighborhood?" Her words, calm yet piercing, hit their mark. Marcus opened his mouth to respond but faltered, the question echoing louder than any excuse he could muster. The murmurs of the crowd grew louder, their phones still trained on the unfolding drama. Before Marcus could speak, Officer Jefferson returned, his face pale and his posture stiff. He avoided Marcus's gaze as he addressed Lena directly. "Ms. Harris." "Agent Harris," he corrected, his tone respectful. "Your credentials have been verified. I've also been informed that you're currently engaged in an active investigation." Lena inclined her head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement. "Thank you, Officer Jefferson. Now if you'd be so kind as to remove these handcuffs." Jefferson moved quickly, fumbling slightly as he unlocked the cuffs and handed them to Marcus without a word. Lena rubbed her wrists briefly, then turned her attention back to the crowd. Her gaze swept over the faces before her, noting the anger, the concern, the quiet hope that justice might still prevail. "You've all witnessed what happened here today," she said, addressing them with the poise of someone used to commanding a room. "Let this be a reminder that no one is above accountability, not even those sworn to protect and serve." Her words were met with murmurs of agreement, the tension in the air shifting from outrage to determination. The young mother with the stroller stepped forward, her phone still in hand. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you for standing up to him." Lena offered her a small smile but said nothing. Her attention returned to Marcus, whose face was a study in barely contained fury. She took a step closer, her voice dropping to a private tone. "Officer Wade, this is your opportunity to reflect. You've made a mistake today, one that won't just disappear. But how you choose to move forward will define the man you become." Her words weren't accusatory. They were a challenge, and in that moment, Marcus felt the full weight of his actions, though pride prevented him from admitting it. He turned away, his jaw tight, as Lena began walking toward her home. But as she reached her gate, she stopped and turned back to the crowd. "This isn't over," she said, her voice carrying both a promise and a warning. "Sometimes, change begins with a single moment. Let's make this one count." The crowd dispersed slowly, their conversations buzzing with the energy of what they had witnessed. As Lena disappeared into her home, Officer Jefferson lingered, his gaze following her. "Marcus," he said finally, his tone cautious, "you really screwed up today." Marcus didn't respond. He couldn't. He simply got into his patrol car and drove away, his mind racing with the implications of what had just transpired. Inside her modest home, Lena placed her bag on the kitchen counter and removed the small recording device. She connected it to her laptop, watching as the footage from the day's encounter loaded onto the screen. But this wasn't just about Officer Marcus Wade. Lena had been gathering evidence for months, evidence of systemic corruption that reached far beyond a single officer. As the footage played, Lena's expression hardened. She saw not just the events of the day, but the broader pattern of misconduct she had been documenting. Each interaction, each abuse of power, painted a damning picture of a system in desperate need of reform. But Lena also knew the risks. Taking on an institution as entrenched as the local police department would be no small feat. It would require courage, strategy, and a network of allies willing to stand by her side. She glanced at her phone, its screen lighting up with a text from Deputy Director Monroe. "Keep me updated. We're counting on you." Lena's lips pressed into a thin line of determination. She knew the battle ahead would be difficult, but she also knew it was necessary. Because this wasn't just about her, it was about the countless others who had suffered in silence, their voices unheard and their stories untold. But as Lena prepared to take her fight to the next level, forces within the police department were already mobilizing against her. What secrets would she uncover in her investigation? And how far would those in power go to protect their own? Stay with us as this story delves deeper into the shadowy corridors of corruption and the fight for justice that would change everything. The air inside Lena's modest home was thick with quiet resolve. She sat at her small oak desk, reviewing footage from the day's encounter. The video wasn't just evidence of Marcus Wade's misconduct. It was the latest piece in a puzzle she had been carefully assembling. For months, Lena had been working undercover, documenting a troubling pattern of abuse and corruption within the local police department. Today's events were a culmination of her work, but she knew they were also a turning point. Her laptop pinged, breaking the silence. It was a message from Deputy Director Monroe. "Lena, tread carefully. We've received intel suggesting your investigation may have been compromised. Take precautions." The words hung heavy in her mind. She leaned back in her chair, her thoughts racing. If the department knew about her investigation, it wouldn't just be her career on the line, it could be her life. Outside, the neighborhood had grown quiet, the earlier commotion replaced by an uneasy calm. But Lena couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The curtain swayed slightly as she peered through the window, scanning the street for anything unusual. A black sedan idled a few houses down, its occupants obscured by tinted windows. It wasn't one of her neighbors. Lena's instincts, honed by years of fieldwork, kicked in. She closed her laptop and began to secure her evidence, transferring files to encrypted drives and concealing physical documents in a hidden compartment beneath her desk. Every move was deliberate, calculated. She knew she didn't have much time. As the night deepened, Lena's thoughts returned to Marcus Wade. His arrogance, his inability to see beyond his own biases, it wasn't unique. He was a symptom of a larger problem, one that permeated not just this precinct, but departments across the country. Lena had seen it before. The unchecked power, the culture of silence, the systemic failures that allowed officers like Wade to thrive. But this time, she was determined to shine a light on it. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call. It was Monroe. "Lena," he said, his voice low and serious. "We've intercepted communication suggesting that Marcus Wade and his superior, Captain Victor Hargrove, are aware of your investigation. Hargrove is not someone to take lightly. He has connections, and he's known for shutting down anyone who gets in his way." Lena's grip tightened on the phone. "What's the plan?" she asked, her voice steady despite the weight of Monroe's words. "We're mobilizing a team," Monroe replied. "But until we can move in, you need to stay under the radar. Whatever you do, don't confront Hargrove directly." Lena nodded, though Monroe couldn't see her. "Understood," she said, her mind already racing with strategies to stay ahead. The call ended, leaving Lena alone with her thoughts once more. But the quiet didn't last long. A sharp knock at the door broke the stillness, echoing through the house like a warning. Lena's heart quickened, but her expression remained calm as she approached the door. "Who is it?" she called, her hand resting on the concealed firearm she kept by the entrance. "It's Jefferson," came the reply. The voice was familiar, but Lena didn't let her guard down. She peered through the peephole, confirming it was indeed Officer Jefferson, the young man who had shown a flicker of decency earlier that day. She opened the door cautiously, her gaze scanning the street behind him. The black sedan was gone, but the unease lingered. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone firm but not unkind. Jefferson hesitated, his eyes darting nervously. "I shouldn't be here," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I couldn't let this go. What Wade did today, it wasn't right. And it's not the first time." Lena stepped aside, motioning for him to enter. Once inside, she closed the door and turned to face him. "You've got my attention," she said. "What do you know?" Jefferson took a deep breath, as if summoning the courage to speak. "Hargrove has been covering for Wade and others like him for years," he began. "False reports, missing evidence, excessive force. It's all swept under the rug. And anyone who speaks out, well, they don't last long." Lena's eyes narrowed. "What about you? Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I've had enough," Jefferson said, his voice tinged with frustration. "And after what I saw today, I can't just stand by anymore. I want to help." Lena studied him carefully, searching for any signs of deceit. But all she saw was a young man caught between his conscience and a system designed to break him. Finally, she nodded. "If you're serious about this, you need to understand the risks. Once you step forward, there's no going back." Jefferson met her gaze, his resolve hardening. "I understand," he said, "but if we don't do something, nothing will ever change." For the first time that night, Lena allowed herself a small smile. "All right," she said. "Let's get to work." Together, they began to piece together a plan. Jefferson provided names, dates, and details, breadcrumbs that could lead to the heart of the corruption. Lena cross-referenced his information with her own findings, the picture becoming clearer with each passing hour. By the time Jefferson left, they had a roadmap for exposing Hargrove and his network. But the night wasn't over. As Lena reviewed the new evidence, her laptop screen flickered. A notification popped up, indicating an unauthorized attempt to access her files. Someone was trying to hack her system. Lena's fingers flew across the keyboard, activating her security protocols and tracing the intrusion. The source was closer than she expected, an IP address linked to the precinct. They were onto her. Her pulse quickened, but her focus remained sharp. She encrypted the remaining files and disconnected from the network, cutting off the hacker's access. It was a temporary solution, but it bought her time. The clock ticked past midnight as Lena sat in the dim light of her desk lamp, her determination unwavering. The battle ahead would be dangerous, but she was ready. She had come too far to turn back now. The pieces were falling into place, but the stakes had never been higher. With her investigation compromised and her enemies closing in, Lena would need to rely on every ounce of her skill and resilience to bring the truth to light. But could she stay one step ahead of those determined to silence her? Stay tuned as the fight for justice reaches a boiling point, and the lines between friend and foe blur in unexpected ways. Lena awoke to the first rays of sunlight filtering through her blinds. Her body weary from a sleepless night, spent piecing together fragments of evidence. The files Jefferson had provided were damning. Forged incident reports, falsified testimonies, and a suspicious pattern of large cash withdrawals linked to Captain Hargrove's personal accounts. It was a network of deceit so intricately woven that dismantling it felt akin to toppling a fortress. Yet, Lena knew one thing: every fortress had a weak point. She sipped her coffee, her eyes scanning a list of names Jefferson had shared. Officers implicated in brutality cases, victims who had filed complaints only to see them dismissed, and internal whistleblowers who had mysteriously vanished from the force. At the top of the list was Marcus Wade, whose arrogance had unwittingly opened the door to Hargrove's empire of corruption. But Lena's gut told her there was something bigger than just a few bad cops abusing their authority. She needed leverage, a piece of evidence so irrefutable it would shatter their defenses. Her encrypted phone buzzed with a message from Monroe. "We've secured Jefferson. He's safe but being watched. Move cautiously. Hargrove knows you're closing in." Lena's jaw tightened as she read the words. Hargrove's reach was broader than she'd anticipated, his tactics more aggressive. If Jefferson was already under surveillance, it was only a matter of time before they came for her. She glanced at the clock, calculating her next move. With her laptop securely packed, Lena drove across town to an old colleague's home, a retired journalist named Victor Langston. Victor had been a thorn in the side of corrupt officials for decades before stepping back from the public eye. His instincts for uncovering the truth were as sharp as ever, and Lena knew she needed his expertise to strategize her next steps. Victor greeted her with a gruff smile, his wiry frame leaning against the doorway. "Agent Harris," he said, stepping aside to let her in. "To what do I owe the honor?" "Victor, I need your help," Lena said, her tone direct. She handed him a folder containing the most critical pieces of evidence. "This is bigger than anything I've handled before. Hargrove's network runs deep, and I don't know how far his influence spreads." Victor flipped through the pages, his expression darkening with each revelation. "This isn't just corruption," he muttered. "This is organized crime hiding behind a badge." He set the folder down and looked at Lena. "Do you have anything solid tying Hargrove directly to this?" "Not yet," Lena admitted, "but I'm close. There's one name that keeps surfacing, Earl Whitman. He's a retired officer who worked under Hargrove for years. Jefferson says Whitman was privy to everything, but he left the force abruptly 5 years ago." Victor raised an eyebrow. "And you think he'll talk?" "He might," Lena said, "but I need to find him first. He's gone off the grid." Victor leaned back in his chair, considering her words. "I can make a few calls. See what I can dig up. But Lena, if you're going after Hargrove, you need to be prepared for retaliation. Men like him don't go down without a fight. I know, Lena said, her voice steady. That's why I need to move fast. Victor nodded, already reaching for his phone. Give me a few hours. Lena left his house feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She spent the afternoon making discreet calls, gathering additional intel from contacts she trusted. By evening, Victor had located Whitman, a reclusive man living in a cabin on the outskirts of town. It was a risk, but Lena knew she couldn't afford to wait. She arrived at the cabin just as the sun dipped below the horizon. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and earth. Lena knocked on the door, her posture relaxed but alert. The door creaked open, revealing a man in his 60s with graying hair and wary eyes. Earl Whitman? Lena asked. Who's asking? He replied, his tone guarded. Lena Harris, she said, holding up her badge. I'm with Homeland Security. I'm investigating Captain Victor Hargrove, and I believe you can help me. Whitman's expression hardened, his hand gripping the edge of the door. I don't know anything about that. Earl, Lena said, her voice softening. I know you left the force because you couldn't stomach what Hargrove was doing. You wanted out, but you also wanted to protect your family. I'm not here to expose you, I'm here to end this. Whitman hesitated, his eyes searching hers for any hint of deceit. Finally, he stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. Inside, the cabin was sparse but tidy, the walls adorned with photographs of a younger Whitman with his wife and 2 children. I don't know how much help I can be, he said, sitting down at the kitchen table. But if you're serious about taking Hargrove down, there's something you need to see. He reached into a locked drawer, retrieving a stack of documents and a USB drive. I started keeping records years ago, he explained. At first, I thought I could take it to Internal Affairs, but Hargrove had them in his pocket. When I realized how deep it went, I knew I couldn't stay. Lena flipped through the documents, her heart pounding as she absorbed the evidence. Bank statements showing illicit payments, internal memos implicating high-ranking officers, and surveillance photos of secret meetings. The USB drive contained even more, a treasure trove of incriminating emails and audio recordings. This is it, Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper. This is what I needed. Whitman's gaze was heavy with guilt. I should have come forward sooner, but I was scared. Hargrove doesn't just destroy careers, he destroys lives. You're doing the right thing now, Lena said, placing a hand on his shoulder. And I promise you, we'll protect you and your family. As Lena drove back to the city, the weight of what she carried pressed heavily on her. The evidence was enough to bring Hargrove down, but it also made her a target. Her phone buzzed with another message from Monroe. Lena, be careful. We've intercepted chatter suggesting Hargrove is planning to retaliate. Don't let your guard down. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, her resolve hardening. The truth was within reach, but the battle was far from over. The evidence Lena uncovered was a game changer, but exposing it would come at a cost. With Hargrove closing in and her allies in danger, Lena would need to decide who she could trust and how far she was willing to go for justice. What sacrifices would she make to ensure the truth came to light? The next chapter will reveal the perilous path she must navigate and the shocking consequences of her actions. The city's skyline shimmered in the distance as Lena parked her car in the shadow of an abandoned warehouse. The USB drive Whitman had given her felt heavier than it should in her pocket, its contents a bomb waiting to detonate. This wasn't just about bringing Hargrove down. It was about dismantling an entire network of corruption that had thrived in the shadows for years. But Lena knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed Monroe's team to authenticate the evidence and ensure it reached the right hands. The warehouse was a temporary safe house, its interior stripped of anything but essentials. Fold-in tables, computers, and a small team of analysts. Monroe stood at the center, his commanding presence anchoring the room. His dark suit and tie gave him the air of someone who thrived under pressure, though the slight furrow in his brow hinted at the risks they all faced. "Lena," he greeted, motioning her over. "What do you have for us?" She handed him the USB drive and a folder containing the documents. "Everything Whitman had," she said. Bank transfers, internal memos, recordings. It's all here enough to take Hargrove and his network down. Monroe scanned the contents briefly, his expression growing grimmer with each page. "This is explosive," he said, "but it's also dangerous. Hargrove won't go down without a fight. And if this gets out before we're ready, he'll bury us." Lena nodded, her jaw tightening. "We don't have much time. He knows I'm onto him, and he's already trying to cover his tracks. We need to move fast." Monroe turned to the analysts. "Get this verified and backed up on secure servers. I want every piece of this cross-referenced. If there's a single thread we missed, Hargrove will exploit it." As the team got to work, Lena's phone buzzed with a call from Jefferson. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "Lena, something's happening at the precinct. Hargrove's in a closed-door meeting with several officers, and they're talking about damage control. I think they know about Whitman." Her heart sank. "Stay out of sight," she warned, "and keep listening. If you hear anything specific, call me immediately." She hung up, her mind racing. Hargrove was moving faster than she anticipated, and the longer they waited, the more time he had to destroy evidence and silence witnesses. But rushing the process could compromise the integrity of their case. The balance was razor thin. As night fell, Monroe's team worked tirelessly to piece together the puzzle. Every connection, every inconsistency was scrutinized until a clearer picture emerged. Hargrove wasn't just protecting dirty cops, he was running a criminal enterprise. Money laundering, drug trafficking, and extortion flowed through the department like a river, with Hargrove controlling the current. His influence extended beyond the precinct, touching local politicians, judges, and even businesses that relied on his protection. Monroe approached Lena with an update, his face grim. "It's worse than we thought. Hargrove's network isn't just local, it's regional. If we take him down, it'll ripple through multiple jurisdictions. That kind of disruption will make a lot of people very nervous. That's exactly why we have to do it," Lena said firmly. "If we back down now, we're letting them win." Monroe studied her for a moment, then nodded. "We'll need a coordinated takedown. Multiple warrants, simultaneous arrests. If we miss even one key player, they'll regroup." The plan was set in motion. Monroe's team coordinated with trusted agents in other jurisdictions, building a task force to execute the operation. Meanwhile, Lena prepared for her next move, confronting Marcus Wade. She knew he was a critical piece of the puzzle, both a perpetrator and a potential informant. His arrogance had made him careless, and Lena suspected he knew more about Hargrove's dealings than he let on. If she could get him to talk, it could solidify their case. The next morning, Lena arrived at the precinct under the guise of filing a formal complaint against Wade. It was a calculated risk stepping into enemy territory, but one she was willing to take. As she entered, the air was thick with tension. Officers avoided her gaze, their loyalty to Hargrove evident in their silence. Wade was at his desk, his posture stiff as he typed on his computer. When he saw Lena, his face flushed with anger. "What are you doing here?" he hissed, standing abruptly. "Relax, Officer Wade," Lena said, her tone measured. "I'm just here to file some paperwork. But while I'm at it, maybe we should have a chat." He sneered. "I have nothing to say to you." "Really?" Lena said, stepping closer. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "Because I think Hargrove might disagree. Do you think he'll protect you once he realizes you're expendable? Because that's what you are. Marcus just another pawn in his game." Wade's bravado faltered, a flicker of doubt crossing his face. Lena pressed on. "You think you're untouchable, but you're not. I have enough evidence to bring this entire precinct down. And when that happens, you'll be the first one they throw under the bus. But if you cooperate, if you help me, I can make sure you're not left to take the fall." His eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. Finally, he leaned in, his voice barely audible. "You don't understand. Hargrove doesn't just control this precinct. He has people everywhere, judges, politicians, even EA. If I talk, I'm dead." Lena's expression softened, but her resolve remained firm. "I can protect you," she said, "but you have to trust me. This is your chance to do the right thing." For a moment, it seemed like Wade might agree. His shoulders slumped. and his gaze dropped to the floor. But before he could respond, a voice cut through the tension. "Agent Harris." Hargrove's deep, commanding voice boomed from across the room. He approached with a practiced air of authority, his sharp eyes scanning the scene. "I wasn't aware you were conducting an investigation in my precinct." Lena turned to face him, her expression calm despite the storm brewing beneath the surface. "Captain Hargrove," she said, her voice steady, "just tying up some loose ends." Hargrove's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Well, I hope you're not wasting our time. My officers have important work to do." "I'm sure they do," Lena replied, holding his gaze. The unspoken tension crackled between them, a battle of wills that neither was willing to concede. As Lena left the precinct, she felt the weight of Hargrove's gaze on her back. The game was escalating, and the stakes had never been higher. She knew she was running out of time, but she also knew she had something Hargrove didn't: the truth. And she was determined to use it to bring his empire crashing down. With Hargrove tightening his grip and the task force racing against the clock, Lena's fight for justice teeters on a knife's edge. Can she outmaneuver a man who spent his career bending the system to his will? And what price will she pay to ensure the truth prevails? Stay tuned as the web of corruption unravels, revealing shocking betrayals and an unexpected ally in the fight for justice. Lena's steps echoed in the narrow alley as she left the precinct, her mind a storm of possibilities and dangers. The encounter with Hargrove had been tense, a reminder that he was watching her as closely as she was him. She had seen the calculation in his eyes, the quiet arrogance of a man who believed himself untouchable. But Lena knew better. She had the evidence, the allies, and the resolve to dismantle his network piece by piece. Still, time was slipping through her fingers, and she could feel the weight of the community's expectations pressing on her shoulders. Back at the safe house, Monroe's team was finishing the authentication of the files Whitman had provided. The evidence was airtight, tying Hargrove to a series of crimes that extended far beyond Sycamore Ridge. Lena stood before a large screen displaying an interconnected web of names, transactions, and locations. Each thread represented a life damaged, a system corrupted, a truth buried. Monroe's analysts had uncovered even more connections, linking Hargrove to an organized crime syndicate that funneled laundered money through small businesses and even city contracts. "It's worse than we thought," Monroe said, echoing what had become a refrain in this case. "Hargrove isn't just protecting his precinct. He's the linchpin in a network that's been siphoning resources and exploiting vulnerable communities for years." Lena's jaw clenched as she absorbed the information. "We have to make this public," she said. "The community needs to know what's happening, and they need to know we're fighting for them." "It's risky," Monroe warned. "If we move too soon, we'll tip our hand, and Hargrove will double down on silencing anyone involved." Lena met his gaze, her resolve unshaken. "If we wait, we risk losing momentum. The people already saw what happened between me and Marcus Wade. They're angry, and that anger can be a force for change. But we have to channel it before it turns into despair." Monroe sighed, nodding reluctantly. "Then we go public. But we need to control the narrative. No leaks, no speculation, just the facts." The team worked late into the night, preparing a press release and organizing a community meeting. Lena coordinated with local leaders, ensuring the event would be a platform for transparency and action. By morning, the wheels were in motion, and word had spread. Flyers appeared on telephone poles. Social media buzzed with anticipation, and whispers of a reckoning rippled through Sycamore Ridge. The meeting was held at a community center, its modest hall packed with residents, activists, and journalists. The air was thick with tension and hope as people gathered to hear the truth about the corruption that had plagued their city. Lena stood at the front of the room, her presence commanding yet approachable. She began by recounting her own experience with Marcus Wade, using it as a lens to expose the systemic issues that allowed such behavior to flourish. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "It was part of a larger pattern system that prioritizes power over justice, silence over accountability. But today, we say no more." Monroe stepped forward, presenting the authenticated evidence. Screens displayed charts and documents, laying bare the extent of Hargrove's corruption. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd as the details unfolded. Bribes disguised as consulting fees, missing funds from community programs, and cases of police misconduct buried under falsified reports. Then came the recordings. Lena played snippets of conversations between Hargrove and his accomplices, their voices dripping with arrogance and entitlement. "They'll never touch me," Hargrove sneered in one recording. "I've got the judges, the council, everyone who matters in my pocket." The room erupted, a mixture of outrage and determination filling the air. Residents stood to speak, sharing their own encounters with police harassment and corruption. A young man recounted how his brother's case had been dismissed, despite overwhelming evidence of brutality. An elderly woman described how a small business she'd owned for decades had been forced to close after refusing to pay Hargrove's so-called protection fees. Lena listened intently, her heart heavy but her resolve stronger than ever. She addressed the crowd, her voice steady despite the emotions swirling around her. "This isn't just my fight, it's ours. Hargrove and his network thrive because they think no one will stand up to them. But together, we can prove them wrong." The meeting ended with a call to action. Protests were organized, petitions circulated, and a legal fund established to support whistleblowers and victims of police misconduct. By the next day, the streets of Sycamore Ridge were alive with the sound of marching feet and the chants of people demanding justice. "No more silence," they cried. "No more corruption." The protests quickly gained national attention, with media outlets picking up the story and amplifying Lena's message. Her calm yet powerful demeanor during interviews resonated with viewers, many of whom saw her as a symbol of resilience and hope. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForSycamore and #EndPoliceCorruption, drawing support from across the country. But as the movement gained momentum, Hargrove's response was swift and ruthless. Officers loyal to him attempted to intimidate protest organizers, raiding homes under the guise of routine investigations. Anonymous threats flooded Lena's inbox, warning her to back down. And yet, the pressure only strengthened her resolve. One night, as Lena reviewed the latest footage from the protests, her phone rang. It was Jefferson. His voice was trembling, his words hurried. "Lena, they're coming for you. Hargrove knows about the meeting, about everything. You need to get out now." Her pulse quickened, but she remained calm. "Where are you?" she asked. "I'm safe," he said. "But they're planning something big. I overheard Hargrove talking about sending a message. I don't know what he means, but it's not good." Lena thanked him, her mind already racing. She knew Hargrove was desperate, and desperation made people dangerous. But she also knew she couldn't back down. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the community, the movement, and the possibility of real, lasting change. As she prepared to leave the safe house, Monroe's voice echoed in her mind. Control the narrative. The evidence was their strongest weapon, but the people were their shield. If Hargrove wanted to silence her, he'd have to face the entire city standing behind her. With Hargrove's retaliation looming and the protests reaching a fever pitch, Lena finds herself at the heart of a battle that will test her courage and conviction. Will the community's unity be enough to withstand the storm? And how far will Hargrove go to protect his crumbling empire? The next chapter will reveal the explosive climax of this fight for justice and the shocking choices that will define its outcome. The night air was thick with tension as Lena drove through the dimly lit streets of Sycamore Ridge, her hands gripping the wheel tightly. The protests had taken on a life of their own, spreading like wildfire through the city. Crowds filled the streets with chants echoing into the night, their determination unshaken despite the growing threat from Hargrove's loyalists. The city was a pressure cooker, and Lena knew it was only a matter of time before it boiled over. But tonight, her focus was elsewhere, on the final pieces of evidence she needed to bring Hargrove's empire crashing down. Monroe's team had uncovered a hidden layer in the web of corruption. Among the files Whitman had provided, they found encrypted communications between Hargrove and a figure known only as the Broker. The messages hinted at offshore accounts, money laundering schemes, and connections to criminal enterprises far beyond the city's borders. Monroe's analysts were working around the clock to trace the transactions and decode the messages. But Lena knew they were running out of time. Her destination was a storage facility on the outskirts of the city, a nondescript building that Whitman had mentioned as a key location for Hargrove's operations. She arrived just past midnight, the facility bathed in the cold glow of fluorescent lights. The lot was empty, but Lena's instincts told her she wasn't alone. She parked her car a block away and approached on foot, her steps silent on the pavement. Inside, the storage units were arranged in neat rows, their steel doors reflecting the harsh light. Lena's flashlight swept across the numbers until she found the one Whitman had described, Unit 47. The lock had been broken, the door slightly ajar, a clear sign someone had been there before her. She drew her sidearm, her heart pounding as she pushed the door open. The unit was filled with boxes and filing cabinets, their contents haphazardly strewn across the floor. Lena moved quickly, sifting through the mess for anything useful. Amid the chaos, she found a laptop with a cracked screen, a stack of ledgers, and a small safe. The safe was heavy, its lock intact. She placed it in her bag, knowing it would take Monroe's team to crack it open. As she turned to leave, a noise behind her froze her in place. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, growing louder with each passing second. Lena pressed herself against the wall, her weapon raised. The footsteps stopped just outside the unit, and a voice called out, low and menacing. "Agent Harris, I know you're in there. Why don't you save us both some trouble and come out?" The voice was unfamiliar, but the threat in it was clear. Lena remained silent, her mind racing. She couldn't risk a direct confrontation, not here, not now. Instead, she scanned the room for an escape route. Her eyes landed on a small ventilation shaft near the ceiling. It was a tight fit, but it was her only option. She moved quickly, pulling herself into the shaft just as the intruder entered the unit. From her perch, she could see him, a burly man with a shaved head and a pistol in hand. He searched the room methodically, his frustration mounting as he found nothing. "You're just making it harder for yourself," he muttered, his voice echoing in the empty space. Lena waited until he moved to the far end of the unit before slipping out of the shaft and into the corridor. She moved silently, her heart hammering in her chest as she made her way to the exit. Outside, the cool night air greeted her like a lifeline. She didn't stop to catch her breath, instead heading straight for her car. Back at the safe house, Monroe's team worked quickly to analyze the items Lena had recovered. The laptop contained emails and transaction logs that tied Hargrove directly to the broker, while the ledgers detailed payments to local officials and businesses. But the safe held the most damning evidence of all: a series of contracts signed by Hargrove, authorizing illegal operations and detailing the distribution of profits. It was a smoking gun, one that could bring not only Hargrove, but his entire network to justice. The next step was clear. The task force needed to move before Hargrove could cover his tracks. Monroe coordinated with federal agents, arranging simultaneous raids on key locations across the city. Lena knew the risks were high. Hargrove wouldn't go down without a fight, but she also knew they couldn't afford to wait. The raids began at dawn, the city awakening to the sound of sirens and flashing lights. Officers loyal to Hargrove resisted, some barricading themselves inside the precinct, while others attempted to destroy evidence. But the task force was prepared, their actions swift and coordinated. By midday, Hargrove and several of his top lieutenants were in custody, their empire dismantled piece by piece. Lena watched from a distance as Hargrove was led out of the precinct in handcuffs, his face a mask of defiance. The crowd outside erupted into cheers, their months of anger and frustration boiling over into a cathartic release. Lena felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she knew the fight wasn't over. The legal battle ahead would be long and arduous, and there were still questions to be answered about the broader network Hargrove had been part of. That evening, Lena addressed the community once more, standing before the same crowd that had gathered for the first meeting. "Today, we took a step toward justice," she said, her voice strong and unwavering. "But this isn't the end. It's the beginning of a new chapter 1, where we hold those in power accountable and ensure this never happens again. This victory belongs to all of us. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers a testament to the resilience and strength of the community. For the first time in months, Lena allowed herself to feel hope. The web of corruption had been exposed, and while the path ahead would be difficult, it was one she was ready to face. The collapse of Hargrove's empire marked a turning point, but the deeper layers of corruption still lingered in the shadows. As Lena and her allies prepared for the trials ahead, new challenges emerged, forcing them to confront questions of trust, loyalty, and the true cost of justice. What other secrets would come to light? And how far would Lena go to ensure the fight for equality continued? Stay tuned as the story delves into the aftermath of Hargrove's downfall and the ripple effects that would change the city forever. The courtroom was packed. Rows of spectators filled the benches, their faces a mixture of anger, hope, and anticipation. Journalists jostled for space at the back, their cameras poised to capture every moment of a trial that had gripped the nation. Captain Victor Hargrove sat at the defense table, his sharp suit doing little to mask the unease etched into his features. Flanked by a team of high-powered attorneys, he exuded a quiet arrogance, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. Across the room, Lena Harris took her seat among the prosecution's witnesses. Her face was calm, her resolve unshaken despite the weight of what was to come. Months of preparation had led to this moment. Monroe's team had worked tirelessly, combing through the mountains of evidence Lena had uncovered. Every document, recording, and transaction had been meticulously analyzed, forming an unassailable case against Hargrove and his network. The prosecution's strategy was clear: dismantle his defense piece by piece, exposing the rot that had festered beneath his leadership. But Lena knew that Hargrove's attorneys would fight tooth and nail to protect him, using every tactic at their disposal to cast doubt on the evidence. The trial began with opening statements, the prosecution painting a vivid picture of a man who had betrayed his oath, corrupted his department, and profited from the suffering of others. The defense countered with claims of entrapment and character assassination, portraying Hargrove as a scapegoat for broader systemic issues. But it was the witnesses who carried the weight of the case. Lena was among the first to testify. As she took the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She recounted her initial encounter with Marcus Wade, her voice steady as she described the escalation, the assault, and the moment she revealed her identity. She spoke of the investigation that followed, detailing the evidence she had gathered and the lengths to which Hargrove's network had gone to conceal their crimes. Every word was measured, every detail precise. The defense tried to rattle her with pointed questions, insinuating that her actions were driven by personal vendettas rather than a pursuit of justice. But Lena remained unshaken, countering their arguments with clarity and conviction. Other witnesses followed. Jefferson, the young officer who had risked everything to come forward, described the culture of fear and complicity within the precinct. He recounted how officers who questioned Hargrove's orders were silenced, either through intimidation or reassignment. Whitman, the retired officer who had kept records of Hargrove's dealings, provided a damning account of the corruption he had witnessed firsthand. His voice trembled at times, but his testimony was unflinching. Then came the recordings. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as Hargrove's voice played over the speakers, his words dripping with arrogance and entitlement. "They'll never touch me," he said in one clip. "I've got everyone who matters in my corner." The evidence was irrefutable, a damning portrait of a man who believed himself untouchable. As the trial progressed, public interest reached a fever pitch. Protests outside the courthouse grew larger, with demonstrators demanding not only Hargrove's conviction, but broader reforms to address the systemic issues his case had exposed. The media covered every development, dissecting the testimony and analyzing the implications of the trial. Lena became a reluctant figurehead for the movement, her calm demeanor and unwavering commitment to justice resonating with people across the country. Inside the courtroom, the defense scrambled to salvage their case. They called their own witnesses, including officers loyal to Hargrove, who painted a picture of him as a decisive leader forced to make tough choices in a challenging environment. They questioned the credibility of the prosecution's witnesses, suggesting that Jefferson and Whitman had ulterior motives for coming forward. But the weight of the evidence was too much to overcome. In the final days of the trial, Hargrove himself took the stand. His attorneys had advised against it, but his ego wouldn't allow him to remain silent. He spoke with practiced confidence, denying the allegations and deflecting blame onto others. But under cross-examination, his composure began to crack. The prosecutor pressed him on the recordings, the financial records, and the testimonies of his subordinates. Hargrove's answers grew evasive, his frustration mounting. By the end of his testimony, the once commanding figure appeared diminished, his arrogance replaced by desperation. The jury deliberated for 3 days, the tension in the city palpable as everyone awaited the verdict. Finally, the courtroom reconvened, the air thick with anticipation. The foreperson rose, her voice steady as she read the verdict. Guilty on all counts. The room erupted in a mixture of cheers and tears, the relief and vindication washing over those who had fought so hard for this moment. Hargrove's sentencing came weeks later. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for fairness, delivered a scathing rebuke as she handed down a lengthy prison term. "You have betrayed the trust placed in you by the people you swore to serve," she said. "Your actions have caused immeasurable harm, not only to the individuals you exploited, but to the fabric of our community. This court will not tolerate such abuses of power." For Lena, the trial's conclusion was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but the scars of Hargrove's corruption remained. She knew the work was far from over. The community still faced challenges, and the systems that had allowed Hargrove to thrive needed to be reformed. But the victory was a symbol of what could be achieved when people stood together against injustice. Hargrove's conviction was a triumph, but it marked only the beginning of a larger fight. As Lena and the community worked to rebuild and reform, new challenges loomed on the horizon. Could the momentum of this victory carry them through the battles to come? And what deeper truths would be uncovered as they continued to peel back the layers of corruption? Stay with us as the story unfolds, revealing the enduring impact of Lena's fight for justice and the ripple effects that would shape the future of Sycamore Ridge. Months had passed since Victor Hargrove was convicted, yet the echoes of his downfall still rippled through Sycamore Ridge and beyond. The city was no longer the same. What had once been a place where fear and silence reigned was now a hotbed of activism, resilience, and the pursuit of systemic change. For Lena Harris, the fight hadn't ended with the trial, it had simply shifted. Her role evolved from investigator to advocate, her days consumed by meetings with community leaders, city officials, and organizations determined to rebuild trust between law enforcement and the people they served. The first steps were small but significant. Following Hargrove's conviction, a federal oversight committee had been established to audit the department. Monroe had been instrumental in forming the task force, and Lena served as an advisor, ensuring that the voices of those most affected by corruption were front and center. Officers with ties to Hargrove's network were either suspended or under investigation. Their influence within the department swiftly eroded. But Lena knew dismantling the old guard wasn't enough. What the city needed was a foundation for something better. Community members rallied to propose reforms, civilian review boards with real power, policies to prevent conflicts of interest, and mandatory training programs focused on de-escalation and bias awareness. It wasn't easy. Every meeting was a battlefield of clashing opinions, with entrenched voices resisting change at every turn. But Lena's unflinching commitment to justice kept the momentum alive. She spoke not with anger, but with resolve, reminding everyone that accountability was not a punishment, but a path to healing. One of the most powerful moments came during a town hall meeting where Lena introduced Jefferson. The young officer, who had risked everything to speak out, stood before a crowd of hundreds. His voice trembled at first, but as he shared his journey from complicity to courage, his words resonated deeply. "I was part of the problem," he admitted. "I stayed silent when I should have spoken up. But silence is what allowed Hargrove and others like him to thrive. I refused to let that happen again." The room erupted in applause, and Lena saw something she hadn't seen in a long time: hope. Jefferson's transformation inspired others within the department to come forward. Officers who had once been afraid now finding the courage to demand change from within. Slowly, the culture of the precinct began to shift. New leadership, vetted by the Oversight Committee, prioritized transparency and integrity. For the first time in years, residents of Sycamore Ridge began to feel that their voices mattered. Lena's fight extended beyond the precinct. With Monroe's support, she spearheaded a national initiative to address systemic corruption in law enforcement. Cities across the country reached out, seeking guidance on implementing reforms. Lena became a reluctant figurehead for the movement, her story a testament to the power of resilience and accountability. She traveled to conferences, met with lawmakers, and appeared on national platforms, always emphasizing that change required collective effort. "This isn't about one person or one city," she often said. "It's about reimagining what justice can look like for everyone." But even as progress was made, challenges persisted. There were threats from those who resented the changes, anonymous messages warning Lena to back off. Some officers accused her of tarnishing their reputations, while others dismissed the movement as a temporary wave of outrage. Lena faced these obstacles with the same calm determination that had carried her through the investigation. She knew change was never easy, but she also knew it was necessary. Amid the chaos of her advocacy work, Lena found moments of quiet reflection. She often returned to the modest white bungalow where it all began, walking the same streets where Marcus Wade had first stopped her. The neighborhood had changed too. The fear that once lingered in the air had been replaced by cautious optimism. Neighbors greeted each other more warmly, and children played freely in yards and parks. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One afternoon, as Lena sat on her porch, she received an unexpected visitor. Jefferson approached, his uniform neatly pressed, his expression both nervous and determined. "Agent Harris," he began, then quickly corrected himself. "Lena, I wanted to thank you for everything." Lena smiled, gesturing for him to sit. "You don't need to thank me, Jefferson. You chose to do the right thing. That took more courage than most people ever show." He nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "It's strange. For the first time, I feel like I'm actually making a difference. It's not easy. Some of the guys still don't trust me, but it feels right." "That's because it is," Lena said. "Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without resistance. But every step forward matters." As they talked, the conversation turned to the future. Jefferson shared his hopes for the department, his ideas for building stronger relationships with the community. Lena listened, her pride in him growing. He wasn't the same hesitant young officer she had met months ago. He was a leader in the making. As Jefferson left, Lena felt a renewed sense of purpose. The fight for justice was far from over, but it was no longer hers alone. A new generation of leaders was rising, ready to carry the torch and continue the work she had started. The city of Sycamore Ridge became a symbol of transformation, a beacon of what was possible when people refused to accept the status quo. Schools began incorporating lessons on civic responsibility and the importance of accountability, ensuring that the next generation would grow up understanding the power of their voices. Local businesses that had once been extorted under Hargrove's regime flourished, their success a testament to the resilience of the community. For Lena, the journey had been one of pain, triumph, and growth. She had faced the worst of humanity and emerged stronger, not because she had been unscathed, but because she had refused to give up. Her story was one of countless others, a reminder that real change required ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Lena's fight for justice wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about proving that even the most entrenched systems could be held accountable. Her courage sparked a movement, her resilience inspired others, and her unwavering belief in the power of community created a legacy that would endure for generations. The work was far from finished, but for Lena, that was the point. Change wasn't a destination, it was a journey. And as she looked out over the city she had helped transform, she knew she wouldn't have it any other way. If this story moved you, join our mission by subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments. How do you think communities can rebuild trust and accountability? Let us know. Together, we can create a better, more just world.